thank Andrea for that wonderful introduction, and to thank the Toledo Museum of Art and the Archaeological Institute of America for inviting me here to talk about my favorite stuff. Archaeologists are detectives by nature and by necessity. Whether we're digging in the ground, in storerooms, in old excavation diaries, or in photo archives, we're trying to solve mysteries, major and minor. This evening, I'd like to share with you my detective work on a Roman luxury villa deeply buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79. For those of you who haven't visited Pompeii and don't have a very good idea of what a Roman villa is, I'd like to offer a few remarks about the many estates that surrounded what the ancients thought to be the most beautiful spot in their world, the Bay of Naples. Most of us are familiar with the typical Roman house, the townhouse or the domus. It consists of a structure that covered the entire lot. The core of this house is the atrium, a hall whose roofs slanted inwards to a square hole in the middle, so that the rain would fall into the catch basin below, and from there to the cistern under the atrium's floor. And by the way, that's the inspiration for the classic court. The most famous organizing principle of the Roman house is the view through. This means that you can see through the entire house, all the way to the back when you're standing in the entryway. Behind the atrium was the garden, surrounded by columns that supported a porticus, giving access to entertainment spaces. The front part of the domus, open to the public during the morning, saw a stream of clients coming in to conduct business with the pater familias, or head of the house. Their path looked like this. They were there for business, or negotium, and did not go into the peristyle garden. That was for the later afternoon and evening when invited guests would join the family for leisure, or otium. They would enjoy baths, meals, and entertainment in the rooms around the peristyle. What about those who were really wealthy enough to own a country estate as well? If the domus looked inward to the garden and to the atrium, the best villas created views outward to enjoy the marvels of the landscape. Here's a wonderful aerial view of a small reconstructed villa, the Villa of the Mysteries, just outside of Pompeii. It is perched on an artificial platform to take advantage of the view of the Bay of Naples. Of course, my red dividing line emphasizes the fact that today it's below ground and the view is of concession stands on the modern parking lot. Note that villas generally reverse the sequence of the spaces found in the domus. A visitor would go from the vestibule located on the road through the peristyle, then into the atrium. From there, he or she would have to leave the axis to arrive at a viewing pavilion. I've marked the viewing pavilion with a red dot. There was an explosion of villa building in the 1st century BC, when wealth poured into Rome from its conquest of the Mediterranean. And wealthy Romans emulated the luxuries of the Greeks and Egyptians they had conquered. There are an estimated 200 villas, sites in the region buried by Vesuvius, most of them luxury villas rather than farming steads. This brings us to Oplontis, where I've worked since 1986. I've marked the site with a red arrow in this satellite view. Amazingly, there is a wall painting that shows a villa much like Oplontis Villa A, as it is officially known. It shows a tall central hall called a propylon with flanking colonnades. A wide garden boulevard marks the axis of the propylon, just as at Oplontis. This watercolor plan shows the gardens as excavated. I've inserted an arrow to mark the axis defined by the garden path. Perhaps it's even clearer at the screenshot from our model on the left, or in the aerial view on your right, where we see the relationship between this grand entryway hall and the atrium at the back of the villa. But when you visit the villa and make your way to the atrium, you're faced literally with a cement wall. We'll see why in a moment. Another mystery. But just for now, imagine that there was once a marvelous view of the Bay of Naples. Most people call Villa A the Villa of Pompeii. An inscription painted on an amphora in the villa routes it to a certain Secundus, presumably a slave belonging to the gens or clan of the Pompeii. Several scholars connecting the inscription to the Emperor Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, have argued that the villa belonged to her. The villa lies covered to a depth of 8.5 meters, about 28 feet, under the modern town of Torre Annunziata, 3 Roman miles west of Pompeii. At that 3-mile point, the name Oplontis appears on the Tabula Pugingeriana, a 12th century copy of a 4th century Roman map. The nature of the settlement at Oplontis is an open question, since excavations, both scientific and casual, have yet to yield a coherent picture. Although modern excavation at Villa A began in 1964, scholars have long known about the existence of an extensive structure in that area. On the map on the right, the map above, you see first the accidental excavation. That was when Domenico Fontana sliced off the front of the villa while digging a canal to bring the waters of the Sarnus River some 15 miles all the way to Torre Annunziata. That's why we have the cement wall. This was in the years 1598 to 1600. By the way, Fontana's canal also cut through the entire ancient city of Pompeii. On the plan, we can see the final course of the canal in red, as well as the area where a second structure, dubbed Villa B, was found in 1974. I've indicated Villa A and B also in the blue square on the aerial view. Note how far away the modern coast is from the villas and the density of the modern buildings of Torre Annunziata. As for bona fide excavations, we know that Francesco La Vega, Carl Weber's successor at Herculaneum, opened a tunnel at the site of Villa A in the 1780s, but he quickly suspended operations because of poisonous gases. In 1833, the Bourbons of the Restoration authorized excavations once again. After a long delay, Michele Rusca, a somewhat shady character, started digging in 1839. Complaining, as archaeologists always do, about lack of funds, he suspended operations a year later in 1840. This large and fragile watercolor plan in the State Archives in Naples shows the extent of Rusca's excavations. In the area in the red box, we see that he has entered the western side of what we now know is the slave's peristyle. It came in from the south at the canal. Rusca carried out his work by means of vertical shafts and horizontal tunnels. Remember, we're 28 feet under, with the intent of finding objects like statues, bronze and silver vessels, and wall paintings to remove. Luckily for us, in the slave quarters, the pickings were slim. Not shown in the 1840 plan is a tunnel going due east that broke through the walls of the U-shaped peristyle that frames the south garden. I've indicated the path of the excavator's tunnel in blue on this slide. They followed the north wall of the garden and the slaves' quarters, broke through that wall to enter the porticus surrounding the south garden, and then they turned south when they reached its eastern wall. They cut out a few landscape paintings along the way, which, by the way, are lost. They then broke through the wall in the area of the east wing of the porticus at about midpoint. This 2009 photograph shows that hole indicated in the modern plan below. All of this is not to say that adventurous privateers stayed away. Indeed, in the period I will concentrate on, that is between 1964 and 1980, modern excavators found lots of evidence of treasure hunters, presumably reusing Rusca's tunnels, burrowing here and there in search of something they could sell. In fact, the daybooks from the 70s mentioned finding a tunnel going along the side of the pool where I have that final blue streak there, where the looters just missed finding the row of statues there. Now, the official beginning of open-face excavations in 1964 was funded by the Casa per il Mezzogiorno, a state agency founded in 1950 to develop the impoverished south half of Italy. The intent of the excavations was to develop the villa as a tourist site. After searching for 6 years, just last year, I finally found 4 pictures documenting the beginning of the excavations. They come from the archive of the amazing American scholar Wilhelmina Jastrzębski, whose pioneering work on the gardens of the ancient Mediterranean began in the Vesuvian region in the 1950s. Wilhelmina kept meticulous notebooks while her husband, Stanley, a physicist, shot the photographs. Thankfully, as we shall see, Stanley photographed much more than his wife's excavation of planting beds and root casts. He shot everything and everyone: the crew, the bulldozers, the frescoes as they emerged from the hardened volcanic mud. Presumably, it was at the invitation of the director of the excavations, Alfonso de Franciscis, that the Jastrzębskis, that is, got to see the modest beginnings of the work. There's not much to see but a hole in the ground revealing the cornice of what we now know as Garden Room 20. You can see that this feature is perhaps 8 feet below the modern topsoil, but to get to the level of the pavement, they're going to have to dig down another 20 feet. To put this photograph in perspective, let me flash forward to 2006, when, with the encouragement of the then superintendent Pietro Giovanni Guzzo, the Oplontis Project took shape. Excavations had ceased in 1983, and by that time, 98 spaces had been uncovered, including beautifully decorated rooms, gardens, and a 61-meter swimming pool. Even though another estimated 40% of the villa still lies to the west, it is likely never to be excavated, since it lies under a modern street and a munitions factory. It was high time to publish what had been discovered. This, in short, is the mission of the Oplontis Project, made possible thanks to my university, private donors, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Institutional partners include King's College London and the American Academy in Rome. We have an international team of 42 scholars who will produce a monograph on the villa in 4 volumes. It will be born digital. It will be an open access book, free to everyone. You simply will go onto the computer and start turning the pages. It is sponsored by the American Council of Learned Societies. The most innovative aspect of the Oplontis publication is the reader will be able to navigate the villa in real time, virtually, through a 3D model. I'm going to demonstrate that model tonight. For now, bear in mind that the model ties all the elements, both architectural and archaeological, to a comprehensive database. This brings me to the archives. Nothing is digitized there. In fact, they don't even have heat. Record keeping for the first 7 years was unusually poor. That's why we're wearing coats. There exist no excavation books for the period, and the earliest photographs in the archives, which is what you see here, date to 1970, over 6 years after they began. The excavation daybook or notebook should record how the excavation proceeded, what was found and where. It should be keyed into the drawings, photographs, and inventory books that document it all. If only. It took me 5 years of searching to assemble the existing daybooks, and as this list makes clear, they represent a very small portion of the work done. Here's what the Italian notebooks look like, written for the most part by the hard-working excavation assistant Ferdinando Balzano. We have transcribed them into a Word document so that they are searchable by keyword. And here are the notebooks of Professor Wilhelmina Jastrzębski, which I discovered in February of last year. They document her excavations in the villa, but in the gardens, for a total of 68 days divided over 8 years. In the entry on the top, she underlines in red the depth of the root cavity, 110 centimeters, a little bit over a meter, and notes that it took 98 buckets of cement and many stones to fill it. And we'll see a picture later of them doing this work. This plan represents the part of the villa excavated in the first 7 years, what I call the lost years. All we have to go on is the numbering system. Now, the way that an excavation works is that you create your plan by assigning a number to each consecutive space that you find. If we look at the plan documenting the excavations of these early years, the first room to be identified, room 1, was a small vestibule leading into the slave quarters. 27 and 32, but they're not yet excavated. Then its twin over there, a lackluster closet, gets the number 2. But the big space with its altar for sacrifices to the protector deities of the villa doesn't get excavated until much later. As you see, it's number 27. Instead, we find 3, a long corridor, then 4, a space between the atrium and the garden room, and then 5, the atrium itself, an important space, and so on. But what the photos I'm about to show you demonstrate is that the excavators had to remove an enormous amount of material before they could have assigned these numbers. What they actually encountered was not discrete spaces, but a jumble of painted walls and debris of collapsed roof tiles, beams and ceilings. In other words, it was a long way down to the pavement level of each room. Here another archive comes into play. In July of 2008, Dr. Secreto Stefani, head of the archives, discovered somewhere, magically, 3 packages wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, and filled with old Oplontis material. They were the lost papers of Alfonso de Franciscis. Tucked among galley sheets, notes, and letters, including several from Wilhelmina Jastrzębski, were 18 transparencies taken in 1966, and 30 black and white prints from the following year. Comparing de Franciscis' photos with those of Stanley Jastrzębski, it's clear that even 2 years later, they're still at the top of walls. In this photo, we see the top of the west wall of the atrium and the intermediate space between the atrium and the garden room, and a Lancia sedan parked on top of what will become the excavation of rooms 15 and 16. It's parked right next to the rude wall separating the excavation from the street running by the munitions factory. I've circled a curious feature that tells us about the desire of excavators to preserve remains of wood, shutters, door frames, and doors. Here they produced a cast at the top of one of the tall doors between the atrium and vestibule by pouring concrete, in this case, into the hollow left in the volcanic ash. It's the same process they used to cast the bodies, the famous bodies. Unfortunately, it's gone today, replaced by a modern reinforced concrete beam. In other words, they broke it. Although the photographer only shot these 3 rooms on that day, and only the tops of the walls at that, the freshness of many of the details is astounding, especially in comparison with their state today. We move forward 1 year with this photograph taken, as you can see, from the northwest margin of the excavations. Here we see a big white number 2 painted on the west wall of that silly closet, 2, and a bit more of the atrium, vestibule, and garden room uncovered. They put up metal roofs farther to the west and over the eastern rooms up to the number 2. Here I've colored in yellow the 4 other rooms where the de Franciscis photographs help us out, shedding light on these early excavations. Back in 1986, I became aware through a drawing executed in the 70s that there once was a painting in the tympanum above the north alcove of Cubicum 11. And we'll see the tympanum up close in a moment. You can imagine how I felt when in 2008 I laid eyes on the 2 photographs that you see on the left from 1967. The painting is a beautiful rendition of a harbor surrounded by turreted walls populated by graceful figures. On the lower margin of the bottom slide, you can see the hardened volcanic ash that was still in the process of being removed. Above, you see a close-up of the scene. Below, what what the best possible contemporary photographs allows you to see. It's a sad loss, but thank heavens for old photos. One of our digital artists has been able to restore the painting in color. We get a sense of the chaotic situation that the workers faced in this photograph of the north wall of the dining room, where excavations have gotten down to the upper third of the preserved wall painting in the northwest corner of the room. I've circled this area in the image on the right. They've dug down on the other side of this northern wall as well, putting them in room 7, which is the kitchen. But perhaps the most dramatic photograph is this one of the adjoining room, a parlor called room 15. It reminds us how violent the cataclysm was. Not only were there earthquakes accompanying the eruption, there were pyroclastic surges made of superheated volcanic mud that sped along the ground and at speeds up to 450 miles per hour and cut down everything in their path. We see two sides of the same wall in this photograph. I've marked its proper location in red on the plan on your upper left. Notice the long diagonal break visible on the two sides of this wall is reconstructed today. The bottom parts of the walls were relatively intact or standing, but everything above that diagonal fissure is put together from pieces. As you can see, the east wall of room 15 fared a lot better than the west wall of room 14, where there are major losses to the painted decoration. And now, again, thanks to a photo from 1967, I can show you what happened. We see the portion of the wall of room 15 that's still standing at the top of the photograph. We can recognize the image of a tragic mask and just ahead of the famous Oplontis peacock sitting on that same ledge. But what is this at the bottom of the photograph? It's an image of the goddess in her circular shrine from the opposite side of the wall. In other words, from a piece of the west wall of dining room 14. The earthquake flipped that wall. These comparisons between the 1967 photos and the actual state photos taken in 2009 give you an idea of the extent of the losses, if only they had had a good conservator there. On top, we see what's left of the frieze of the decoration, illegible today, but clearly legible as a shield frieze in the black and white photo. On the bottom, we see a portion of the wall with a shield image, the so-called imago clipeata. By the way, in the gallery, there's a very beautiful one in silver and gold, as it was found, and on the right, a color detail of its essentially erased state today. In fact, just about everything to the left-hand side of this wall is so fragmentary as to be unintelligible to anybody but the most stubborn visual scholar, and I guess that would be me. I've outlined in white the area where we have remnants of the painted plaster that divided the two decorative schemes on the wall. To the left is a relatively flat decoration. You can't see much of it, consisting of faux marble panels, whereas to the right of that pilaster, we have the marvelous, dramatic perspective constructions that seem to extend back into space. This is the famous mature second style from the beginning of the villa in 50 BC. The red triangle shows where a fragment that the workmen were unable to save would have fit this big piece of plaster. It gives us the capital of the pilaster, that is that pier, quite clearly, and the frieze of arms that we just saw. Now, what have I done with these photographs? I've shared them with our collaborators, King's Visualization Lab at King's College London, who have taken up the job of creating the 3D model that we'll see tonight. Martin Blaseby, an expert in digital reconstruction, has used these images for his original state reconstruction. As you will see, the digital model allows the viewer to switch back and forth between actual state and reconstructed views of the frescoes in many of the rooms of the villa. I want to share one more mystery from these 1967 photographs. It's whatever was happening on the east of the excavation. And again, no written records whatsoever. On the map, I show you the direction the photographer is pointing his camera due north. On the map, I show you the direction. We see on the left of the photograph the metal roof covering the walls of the atrium, room 4, and then farther to north, the garden room, 20. But on the right, it looks as if they are digging down into room 23 and going north. And indeed, that's just what they're doing. We see the south wall of the northernmost room, 30 in this slide, and then we get a look over to corridor 6 and so on. What is going on? This photograph tells us most about the excavation methods. In 1967, we have the exploration of standing walls, the north and west walls of room 23, and the plaster still adhering to the exterior wall of that room. Workmen are clearing the rubble as best they can. They put cloths weighted down by stones on top of the walls, and there are lots of wooden poles at the ready to build a temporary tin roof. Let's hope it doesn't rain. I see no boxes for fines. What is worse, there are two important areas that will soon be history, as they say. I put red circles, two red circles, where we see the remains of the tops of the walls that were semicircular. In other words, they were in the tympanum form, indicating that there was a suspended cross vault over this room. And as you can see on the right, it's now reconstructed as a very ugly reinforced concrete ceiling. No trace of either tympanum or the stuccos to be found. They threw it away. In the following year, in the summer of '68, the Dashemskis came back, and luckily for us, Stanley was shooting everything in sight. His photos show garden room 20, the room we started with, now excavated nearly down to the pavement level. And we can see that by now, the Vitiello construction company has been busy with reinforced concrete. They've poured a concrete beam over the fragments of columns on the south side of the garden room, and more concrete to reconstruct the south wall of the pro-pylon. 2 years later, we finally get the first photograph in the archive of the Superintendency. We can see that reconstruction is the order of the day along the north porticus, yellow in the plan. Although there are no photographs to document the finding of the 5 statues there, these photos show the excavation of the colonnade, violently cut by pyroclastic flow rushing in from the north garden. Just cut those columns like that. Just about everything is remade to look new. It's the same story with the pro-pylon, basically a total ruin in the upper photograph, and then reconstructed, as you can see, a couple of years later when some more of the north garden has been excavated. Comparing these two plans, we see where things stood in 1972. I shaded the 1978 plan to show you that about a third of the villa had been excavated by 1972. In the frenetic pace of the next 8 years, excavations uncovered a huge area of the north garden, the south garden, the east wing rooms, and most of the swimming pool. We need more information. And another boon to the Oplontis photographic archive came through the generosity of a local amateur historian, Vincenzo Marasco. When I put word out in Torre Annunziata that I was looking for old photos, Marasco appeared. His passion for the archaeology of Torre Annunziata has resulted in an amazing personal archive. He contributes regularly to Vesuvio Web, a web journal full of fascinating historical articles and images, and he also is contributing to our publication. I couldn't resist showing you a few photos from Marasco's archive documenting the visit of Princess Margaret of England to Oplontis in 1973, August 15th, as you can see, long before it was open to the public. We see the princess alighting from a Fiat, note the shoes, then posing with Signor Balzano, and then checking out a newly restored porticus. Aside from the historical interest of these photographs, especially the princess's wardrobe for the occasion, some of the photographs document the progress of the excavation. By the way, when I showed this picture to the eminent British historian Andrew Wallace-Hadrill, he said that royals never take photographs. They have others take photographs for them. Obviously, that's a rule that the ever-rebellious princess didn't follow. See her, she's shooting right in the middle there. Her Nikon up to her face. If we look behind the group, we see the atrium as it was at this moment. And here the detective in me comes out. Compare it with a picture of 1968 on the lower left from the Dashemski archive, when only half of the wall is standing, and just barely. It had collapsed completely in the meantime, and on the bottom right we see an actual state photograph where I've indicated with red arrows what it looks like today. reconstructed. The wall painting there was consolidated, hung literally on this modern section of wall. Someone looking at it today would think that it was found intact instead of in near total collapse. And I also want you to note all the large fragments of wall painting sitting on the floor of the atrium in the black and white photograph. They're on the edge of the impluvium. I will come back to those later. Here we move forward to 1975 when Drzemski, Italian workmen, and students from the University of Maryland, which is where Drzemski taught, excavate the south garden. In this garden, Drzemski found root cavities in pots buried next to each column of the porticus, perhaps for ivy to grow up the columns. We could try that in a year. Lots of columns. Parallel to these was a second row of pots for rooting plants to make a walkway about 2 meters out from the porticus. And she believes they were lemon trees, by the way. Notice the state of the porticus that surrounds the garden in the state of corridor 46, which is the other side of it, famous for its immensely high ceiling with carefully restored frescoes. In the photo from 1975 on the lower right, you can see it's all of that high. In the slide on the left, you see the way it's now restored. It was Stefano De Caro who undertook the Herculean task of reconstruction. He carefully recomposed all the fragments of the amazing ceiling frescoes. And the reason that the ceiling slants instead of being flat is that the pieces of the ceiling, once assembled, were too big for the actual width of the corridor that the ceilings covered. When De Caro found bits of plaster that defined the slanting roof, not seen in this slide, by the way, he worked out the solution that we see today. Drzemski's excavations in the north garden found much larger root cavities than in the south garden. On her plan, I've circled one that she identified as a very old clump of perhaps 25 oleanders that had fused together. Oleanders grow like weeds still today in southern Italy. Following the methods of the time, they filled the root cavity with concrete. You can see the wire used for reinforcement in the slide on the lower left, with Professor Drzemski overseeing. In her notebook, she exclaims about the 98 buckets of cement that it took to fill this cavity. Workmen left the bottommost layers of the garden fill alone, waiting for Drzemski and her crew to clear out the last of the lapilli, that is the tiny volcanic pumice, and look for root cavities. In the image at the top, we see the root cavities, after they've been cleaned out, covered with stones, awaiting the cement to cast them. And on the bottom, we see the casting process. Once the cement dries, it's time to clear away the soil and look at the form of the root. Stanley Drzemski documented the excavation of Equus 69, that is the reception space 69, the largest room of the east wing. But at this point, there are about 8 feet to go before they reach the floor with its beautiful cut marble decoration. The eastern wing is about 4 feet below the level of the north garden. Fortunately, most of the walls of the famous garden rooms with garden painting were found standing, and this is the east wing, as we can see in these 2 slides. They are a special feature of this wing, open to the air, inaccessible except through windows, and painted to resemble gardens, complete with fountains, bushes, and birds. In the slide on the top, we can see that the workmen have just finished reinforcing the ancient portion of the wall, with the wall painting still adhering, and then they built a new wall above it. In the lower slide, we see Professor Drzemski posing with the trowel as the work progressed, uncovering the next section of the wall to the left. She marvels at a beautifully preserved section where she is no doubt trying to identify the plant species growing behind the square fountain. But note, by the way, it's an oleander, but note the methods used to keep the frescoes from detaching. Workmen have troweled cement along the upper edges of the break, and they have nailed a board to the left-hand edge. By 1977, most of the east wing had been excavated, the walls restored, and the roofs rebuilt. That summer, Drzemski commissioned the Whittlesey Foundation to take aerial photographs for many gardens that she had excavated in the region. These images illustrate her 1979 book, The Gardens of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the Villas Destroyed by Vesuvius, with a special chapter on Oplontis. Note that the white of the root casts shows in this photograph just as they appear in the plan below, the fold-out plan at the back of the Gardens of Pompeii. In the balloon photograph, we can see, I've put a red box around it, a group of old houses at the northeast of the excavation that are soon to be demolished, clearing the way for the excavation of what turned out to be the 61-meter swimming pool. In the plan below, I show this unexcavated area in light orange. In the following 2 years, excavators carried on their search and found the northern extremity of the swimming pool. Here I compared Dushenski's plan of the villa with ours above. That's the Oplontis Project official plan with all those boxes in gray. 2 colors of gray are our 16 trenches. The trenches from that period found the northern ends of the pool, but they couldn't go any farther since there's a busy modern street above, Via Regina Margherita. I think the feature at the north end of the pool, is just a guess, must have been a great big fountain house like the one of the similar villa at San Marco at Stabio. The following years were slated for cleanup and consolidation of the difficult fragmentary wall paintings. This was a process that stalled repeatedly. In 1986, I saw literally hundreds of fragments of this fresco lying on trestle tables waiting to be reinserted into the walls of this long porch along the western side of the pool. I was astounded to see years later that the job finally did get done, and rather well. Other wall fragments and wall paintings never did find a home. In fact, and you've been wondering how they do it, it's only in Stanley Dushenski's photographs that we see just how workmen dealt with detached fragments. If they found a detached fragment of fresco, they placed it face down on a table. They cut down the ancient plaster backing to create a regular surface. Then they put galvanized steel wire for reinforcement. They also formed this wire into loops so that they could hook the fragment back onto the reconstructed wall. They then built up the modern cement around the reinforcing wire. Once the fragments from a room were consolidated in this way, they would cement them onto the reconstructed wall, squirt them off with water, and hope that they were in the right place. In the detail of room 14 above, you can see these guidelines, that you can still see them, that restorers used to position the fragments on the wall. This brings me back to my fragments, or I should say, the fragments that we saw on the atrium floor. One of the biggest errors made in the haste to make the villa into a museum was to construct a facsimile of the typical impluviate atrium roof. Too soon. On top we see what was visible in 1966, and below we see the reconstructed wall as we have it today. Note that 2 fragments were found later and then put into the reconstruction. Those are the circled ones. Unfortunately, after the construction company had decided the height of the roof, many more second-style fragments belonging to the atrium came to light. In this slide, you see a selection of the larger ones as photographed in December 1973, and below are my photos done in 2008. What to do? One of our architects, Timothy Lydell, worked with the puzzle presented by the atrium fragments. Using Photoshop and Illustrator, he was able to place a number of the orphaned fragments into a plausible scheme that fits with the architectural perspectives on the standing wall. Since the only column capital among the atrium fragments is ionic, like the columns that we have here, Lydell hypothesized an ionic upper order. The pieces fit quite well, the only problem being we don't know the exact height of the columns. Lydell's reconstruction is deliberately quite conservative. After all, he was trained at Cornell. And for this reason, only some of our orphaned fragments have found a home. A full, intelligently imaginative reconstruction of the decoration, recently completed by Martin Blaseby of King's Visualisation Lab, takes Lydell's ionic architrave and elaborates an upper story. These 2 reconstructions come from combining 2 kinds of archives, photographs and the actual fragments found in storage, if you can call it storage. This inspires me to show you what I call the archive of orphaned fragments. Sounds like the name of a movie. These are the pieces of the villa that never made their way into the living museum that you visit today. It's basically a very sad story, with, I hope, a happy ending. This is a photograph of room 28, one of the 3 rooms used since 1970, room 73, as a storeroom. I use that term loosely. As you can see from the tottering yellow cases at the back and the collapsed wooden shelves at the right, it was a storage area for archaeological materials. But by the time we got there, it had become a refuse dump. When we finally got permission and provided the funds to clear these rooms of all modern materials, we extracted several tons of junk, including 4 pedestal sinks. This is what the room looks like today. We have systematically cleaned, inventoried, described, and entered into our database thousands of fragments of fresco. And in that back corner, you see what I'm going to be doing between May 20th and June 20th. That back corner is going to get cleaned out. In 2006, you literally could not get into the room next door, 29, without moving a case full of finds or a big hunk of wall painting. For this reason, the room, which has important remnants of 2 successive frescoes in the 4th style, had never been studied or photographed. In 2010, we emptied it and photographed it, and there are my sweaty helpers. We now have electric light and a high-speed internet line, and I wonder what the slaves who lived in this part of the villa would have thought, seeing us with our computers and internet in their digs. Here's the crew, of course. What did we discover through this gargantuan effort beyond the remaining fragments of room 5, the one, the atrium, which I just showed you restored? We found numerous fragments of the scheme found in a partially excavated room that was never restored. And you see what it looks like as restored in the lower left, and then all of the further fragments I just threw into storage. Last but not least were these delicate fragments belonging to a ceiling. We know because it's a ceiling, because their backs show the impression of the reed laths that they used to hold the plaster in place. I suspect that they belong to the lost ceiling of Porticus 60. As you may recall, excavators found this porticus in ruins. It had fallen down sometime before the eruption itself. The delicate technique on white ground seems to go well with the unusually fine painting preserved on the standing walls of the porticus. We can put these fragments back into the villa, but virtually in our digital model. Speaking of hidden treasures, another element of the villa that you never see is its sculpture. It was in the north garden that the first sculpture emerged that was still in its original setting. On the upper left, in a Dashemsky photograph from 1975, we see the discovery of the second of 4 shoulder busts that in the north garden. The photo next to it shows the bust temporarily set up on a pillar. It's a female head, a Julio-Claudian lady. And on the lower left, the last of the sculptures to be found along that diagonal garden path, the bust of a smiling boy with a thick vegetal crown wrapped with a fillet and long hair. Take a good look. It was stolen and never recovered. As excavations continued to the east, more sculpture was found in its original setting. In this image, solid lines indicate sculpture found in place, and dotted lines, the many pieces found out of place, apparently stored in antiquity and awaiting restoration and reinstallation. I've colored the 4 sculptures found in the north garden, aligning the diagonal path in light orange. In 1978, the Dashemskys returned to witness the discovery of 4 of the statues that lined the eastern side of the pool, the ones that miraculously the Bourbon tunnelers missed. I particularly like the photograph of a workman with the statue of an alighting victory. He looks like he's falling in love. And by the way, this man is still around. I just saw him recently when I was at Pompeii. He's not quite so young. His hair is strangely turned white. I don't know how that happens. The photographs on the right show the finds of that year with the partially excavated swimming pool, and they put the sculptures back in place. A big crater rigged up as a fountain was not actually found there, but rather in a service corridor near the slave quarters. But its base fits perfectly into the hollow, and they even found the lead water pipe. In the process of finishing up this part of the excavation, excavators found 3 more statues: the torso of Artemis, the herm of Dionysus, and the head of a Julio-Claudian boy. In the photograph on the top left, Ferdinando Balzano, the wonderful head assistant who kept those notes that we looked at, is adjusting the head of the ephebe found in the previous year. While on the lower left, we see a group of workmen carrying the torso of Artemis. She's trussed up like the victim of some ancient hunt with ropes and tied to 2 stout poles. They're about to carry her up the ramp and into the storage facility. It must have been an amazing procession for the townspeople to watch, accustomed as they are to processions of the Madonna through the street. Well, it's a different Madonna for sure. I wonder what they thought of the group of hermaphrodites struggling with a lascivious pan on the lower right. With the work of Professor Erik Moorman of Rabou University in the Netherlands, we have been able to put the sculpture into order. We move here, of course, to the above-ground storage area created in the 1970s, where, when it's not traveling, the sculpture of the villa lives. The quarters are cramped, for the sculpture shares space with the finds from Villa B, as well as all the small finds, including ceramic lamps, bronze hinges, a host of objects. In 2010, I assisted Moorman in his efforts to study the sculpture. Some of the large-sized pieces were at the Bosco Reale Museum, which you see in the upper right, and that's a kind of a clean, dry space, where we had to study several objects still in their packing crates. After spending a week with the sculptures, I know what Pygmalion must have felt when he fell in love with the statue. Here's one of our Nikes from the east side of the pool, without her wings, but her feet intact, showing her just in the act of landing. And here's the detail of the face of her neighbor, a beautiful ephebe. It is my great pleasure to announce that we have gotten permission to bring several of the sculptures, as well as my wall painting fragments, to several museums in the United States. We're working to open the exhibition at the Kelsey Museum in Ann Arbor, right near, in 2015. And then it shall travel, I hope, to Austin, Texas, and to Bozeman, Montana. Montana State is there. Time does not permit me to recount what we've learned from our 15 trenches, but I can tell you the hottest news. We now know that the villa was perched dramatically on a cliff 40 feet above the sea. Our geologist, Giovanni Di Maio, has completed his study based on a deep trench in the north garden and many cores drilled to the south of the villa, some going down as far as 90 feet below the modern surface. This blue line represents the sea level today, even though the sea is half a mile away. The purple is Paleolithic lava of 12,000 years before present. I don't know why they don't use BC and AD, they just say before present. These geologists have their own clock. And that's what the villa is sitting on. The blue, above and below, is volcanic material of 79. Notice it's on 2 totally different levels. The red dots represent other villas along the coast. And interestingly, not all of the coast was altered, just the coast of the cove and cliff where Oplontis lies. So those red dots are all pieces of villas that you can see, some of them almost on the modern seashore. Using Google Earth, we've also determined what the view was from the villa, and we're in the process of modeling this view for publication in Volume 1. To sum up, the excavations at the so-called Villa of Pompeii stand at a crossroads in a long history of excavations in the region buried by Vesuvius. They aimed to make the villa into a living museum that the public could visit. This meant creating a new building that looked ancient. Walls had to be rebuilt, and colonnades had to be reconstructed to support modern concrete beams and new roof tiles. In the process, much of what made the villa so attractive in antiquity had to be sacrificed. The sculpture had to be removed to safekeeping, as well as all objects subject to vandalism or thievery. When the funds dried up, restorers gave up on the fragments of wall painting that didn't easily fit back into the walls. The gardens never got restored properly, despite the wealth of evidence discovered by Dushenski. And if they had been replanted correctly, the replanting itself would have destroyed the archaeological evidence. We can now, through virtual means, put the pieces of the puzzle back together. As we've seen, the idea of the archive of an excavation is changing from that of a catalog of objects classified according to their materials to an interwoven and indeed interactive experience. The ideal archive is one that allows us and future generations to find the material easily electronically and to study it in the context of the place where it originally functioned. And as atmospheric elements degrade the villa itself, and if another earthquake occurs like the disastrous earthquake of 1980, and it will, we may lose the villa. What we hope to facilitate is just the kind of retrieval and study that links to a database, an interactive 3D model, a record of what's there, putting fragments back in place, showing what came from our trenches and cores, making this information, as well as the 4-volume publication, available for free on the web. In this way, if and when excavation of the villa continues, scholars of the future will be in much better shape than we were. They will have at their fingertips all of the information they need to complete their study of this rich and complex villa. And now I want to go to, I hope, our 3D model. I've never done this before, folks, so you're getting late-breaking news here. Okay, the model is up. Let's jump. Start with the front of the villa. Now this slider is not great. Oh, I know my way around pretty well. Okay. So it works, it's a game. The way we did this, it's a gaming engine. So we're in a backspace. I'm going to take you up front. We're in a gaming engine, which is called Unity. For those of you who know computers, it's modeled in 3D Studio Max, which is what architects use. And there's our scarp. That's the parking lot up there. There are the modern steps taking you down. That's the sky. These are the white root casts of Jaschemski on the plan, and you've got a mini plan in the upper left. So there's that propylon that we started with. You probably think it was ages ago when I started. I never quit, do I? And here we are, going into the propylon, and we have, for those of you who like masonry, a complete analysis of actual and fake masonry is available. As you saw, this wall was completely demolished. And if you like mosaics, you can look at the floors, see these wonderful mosaics. Now, it's low resolution so that you can navigate quickly. Otherwise, you would be waiting here all night just to see a part of it if we were high res. We tried high res and it didn't work. So we're going to go back, and to get to the atrium, interestingly, you have to go down these long corridors on either side of the garden. Enclosed garden. And there's the enclosed garden. And then a view through, so it's the back view through to the front garden. The land side, okay? And now, we turn around and walk into the atrium. Now there's that hideous modern concrete roof that's too low, etc. There's the wall of the Sarno Canal. But check this out. And then, because miraculously these wall painters made mirror images on the right and left walls of rooms, absolute symmetry using grid lines, which I've done some work on. You can find the grid lines when the plaster falls off. You have perfectly symmetrical representations. And of course, the idea here is to give people the idea that of a royal hall with just the most amazing, I mean, the closer you get, the better it looks. Now, in case you thought that wasn't enough, we want to bring this into the database and cross your fingers. That little white, connecting. We're going to Texas, folks. You didn't think you were going to Texas tonight. This is Corral. It's called Loving Corral. That's where we live. And this is our database. Our database has a complete description of this wall with all the scholarly information. It's got our inventory of related photographs. Let's try one. So that's a thumbnail. This is our database. That's a medium high res. So I should be able to click on that. Cross your fingers again. My God, it worked. So this is actually a 24 gigabyte image, which means that you get super, super high resolution. I wouldn't even tell you what these photographs cost. Okay, let's go back. I'm not going to. So, back to the model. Where's the model? Enough of this database stuff. So you can shut off this restoration. Let's look at that little bedroom that had the ceiling that was the tympanum that was lost. Nobody knows how it was lost because nobody would take responsibility. Okay, move over a little bit. Here it is. Here's the whole room. The floor, the walls, and amazingly they were able to keep the ceilings, and that's a cast of the shutters of the big window that looked out onto the view, which they were able to do. And, okay, here we're looking at it. Oh, went too fast. And now, nice, huh? This is a room that was, again, very poorly treated. There's a reinforced concrete roof that's falling in, by the way, a ceiling. And then as restored, this is a very simple, a very severe room of a later period when the style changed around, well, I dated to 1. So all this stuff, the beautiful second style walls are 50 BC, and then the place gets redecorated between about 1 and 15. And then it gets extended to the east, to the pool area that we were looking at around the year 45. So there it is. And here's that poor, miserable wall that they lost most of. I keep running into walls. If I were 16, I could do this really well. But alas. So here we go. Isn't that wonderful? Hooray for Oplontis. Okay. Here's the room next door. That's what it looks like now. Okay, so I know I'm boring you to death. It's like showing pictures of your children. In my case, grandchildren. Could be great-grandchildren by this time. And then, let's go over to the pool. Okay, there's the pool, and as you see, they put a modern roof where the original porch was, and there were all the columns along here were found in storage, so the porticus was not standing. It may have been devastated by the earthquake of '62, which was, of course, the warning sign that Vesuvius was going to blow. Nobody knew it was volcano because it hadn't blown since the Toledo eruption, which is prehistoric, of, let's see, 1800 BC. So, beautiful floor with marble and mosaic. And here's this huge, one of 3 big entertainment spaces. And this is the really cool thing about Oplontis. Well, they were able to reconstruct the ceiling a bit, and it had a niche in the back for a statue, and then they put dining couches out here. But this is the incredibly cool thing that is nowhere else but at Oplontis. Although there are similar architectural structures, these are the garden rooms. Aren't they amazing? That's what we saw Deshemsky, posing with her trowel. I don't think she ever dug of anything in her life. She always got students to do it, smart woman. And here we see these wonderful garden paintings. Now, they were, in antiquity, they were open to the air and rain, because we have rain gutters around the edges. So you could be in the dining room, it could be raining, you could be looking out at the pool this way. To your right and to your left, you saw these windows with garden painting. Here, I'll show it to you again. It's quite amazing. So imagine yourself on the dining couch. You look to your left. When you look up, you see the thing. You look out to the pool. And then you look to the right, and you see more of these garden rooms. And they line up and go back all the way in space, 60 meters, 180 feet. And so you'd have the relative dark of the covered room, and then you have the light shining down on the paintings. And I'm going to try something. I'm feeling bold. We're going to jump into the garden room. I learned this from my nephew. I jumped in. That's the only way you can get in if you try. Now, I can't get out unless I jump. See? Bang. Bang. But if you do this, got it. There's the marble. A lot of the marble was robbed away or lost when they uncovered this, and you saw it was really deeply covered in 78. And there are two theories. One, and the walls were all covered in marble. So this is the finest possible decoration, even more expensive than hiring someone to do a fresco. And it seems that it may have been robbed away or sold in antiquity, because the villa was abandoned at the time of its discovery. No bodies, let's jump into the pool, and no, that refresh, we need water. You can put water in there. So you get an idea of this place. Anyway, enough of my nonsense. Thank you so much.